This episode discusses a rather bone-chilling story of an individual born and raised in a highly destructive and authoritarian cult. The Children of God, now recognized as Family International, was originated by David Berg in 1968 in California and has now expanded worldwide with tens of thousands of members in over 90 countries. Branching out from Christianity, Berg preached two main beliefs, one being the impending end time of humanity and the other being the law of love as the most superior teaching. Over the years, the cult has been forced to undergo several changes due to legal scrutiny and accusations for its physical, mental, and sexual abuse towards minors. The early 2000s saw a huge exodus of members vocalizing their stories of horror and trauma, and I've had the honor of interviewing one survivor today. Welcome to Multispective. So welcome to Multispective.
Yeah, thanks for having me here.
It's so lovely having you here. So I did read a little bit about your story, and I'm really, really curious to know a little bit more about this. So why don't you just start off by telling us a little bit about yourself and your childhood?
Well, I was born in the late 70s into a cult known as the Children of God. It was a religious cult that at the time had about 10,000 members, I believe, in 60 countries maybe worldwide. It started off in California and then around 1968, I believe, and my parents were joined a year or two later in California, then Texas, and then got married and then were sent, I guess, as cult ambassadors to Canada and then various countries in Europe, and then encouraged to have a bunch of children and so on. And then, so I was the fourth child born and in quick succession, as the cult preferred it, wanted their members to have as many children as possible, I guess, to get the numbers up. And also they figured children were useful as fundraisers, and, they used to have us perform in public, singing, dancing, whatever, or put some children into, try to get them doing commercials or other things which would bring money in and maybe get some publicity. And the children were seen strictly as tools to make, money-making tools, I suppose,
Mm-hmm. So I just want to dial back a little bit. You mentioned that your parents started when basically a year or two when the whole cult even began. So they were sort of like the OG, they were there right when it started. So, there was so many transitions and changes that happened with this cult over the years. So I'm just sort of curious to know, what drove them to start it in the first place? What was the vision that was being sort of narrated around that got your parents into it?
Well, they were upper middle class, or on my mom's side, and my father came from, his family was extremely well off, and they were spoiled, rich kids that decided they wanted to be hippies and just, drop out of university and bum around North America, or, would do whatever, so then I guess they got into, a little bit of the drug scene, experimentation in psychedelics and, marijuana, whatever, which was big in the 60s. And then I guess they felt their life was meaningless or, lacked something. So they were prime targets for this cult, which made you feel like you were part of something and important, like a revolution. They sold it as, and they thought they were going back to New Testament style Christianity, whereas they're going out and evangelizing and doing something important, and that they were the ones on the cutting edge of what God's will was, I suppose, and revealing the true nature of what Christianity was supposed to be according to the cult anyways, right? They were made to feel they were superior to regular organized religion. There was divided into churchianity, which would be traditional, say Catholicism or Protestant churches. And then they were real Christians, so they were taught to look down on the regular organized religion, and they were lazy and not following God's will unless you were part of this cult. So that's pretty much how it began. Yeah.
It's so interesting because the whole idea behind Christianity and just the love for Jesus and God and, getting into it it's all based around love and forgiveness and, inclusion. And so the fact that they had sort of split in different branches and actually competed with one another is super ironic.
Yeah, well, it was interesting how early days of the cult, the founder was went by dozens of different names, whatever. But it was like David Berg. He was like a washed up minister, but he had failed at everything in life. And he was pushing 50 years old. Was like a lifelong loser, and he had been kicked out of like all his postings before, rumored to be sexual improprieties or something. Like he was not a good person at all. So I guess it was his personal axe to grind with organized religion that was his way of getting revenge, I guess, and bringing them down.
Did your parents know David Berg personally, and were they working very close with
Yeah,
you?
they were, I believe they joined in Huntington Beach, California. When they joined, they didn't know it was like this was a weird thing or anything, right? They just thought it was like, like countercultural, but it was trendy at the time. And so he was like trying to look like a beatnik or something and get the young people, because that was the only people I guess he found that were willing to follow him. And plus they were like motivated to go out and do something, I guess. So the cult leader was actually working under the umbrella of like some other like recognized religious groups there that were funding him. And like a year or two later, they were given use of a ranch just outside of Austin, Texas, which is where my parents went through their boot camp to become like really indoctrinated into the cult beliefs and whatnot. And then from there, they sent those people out as their ambassadors to like Israel and Europe and Canada and wherever else. But I believe at the time too, the cult was experiencing some heat from the US government for tax evasion, and there might have been, I don't know what else. So I think he was starting to get investigated. So he decided it was better for them to go international and out of the reach of the Justice Department and FBI, I believe. Yeah.
Right. Can you talk to me a little bit about what was some of the big distinguishing beliefs that they had that stood them out from Christianity itself? I know that there was something that was talked about the end time of humanity and, the law of love. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
It was like an apocalyptic cult. So we were taught to believe that it was supposed to have been around 1986, the Antichrist that was prophesized in the Bible, whatever, that was going to take power and form a one world government. And then as all Christians' duty was to resist this cult, and the highest honor or the highest thing you could achieve in life was become a martyr for your beliefs. And then I believe it was around the early 90s, like the tribulation. And then in 1999, according to the cult, there was supposed to have been like a resurrection and then like the final battle of Armageddon or something. And God or Jesus would come down and resurrect his followers that were martyred and basically destroy all the evil forces on the earth or something. So it was like really bizarre beliefs,
Yeah.
So it was like, I remember as a child being told, like, oh, aren't you fortunate? You're going to get to be a martyr one day. And I was like, oh, well, it doesn't sound so great on my end here, but whatever. It's just sort of a very weird upbringing. And then as far as the law of love, like that was brought in the later 70s, like after I was born. And then that's when they got into like, we're all part of one family. We're all God's family and we're all married to each other. So like adults would just go around and sleep with basically whoever they wanted in the cult. Initially, that wasn't going on, except maybe within the cult higher ups that was kept quiet from the rest of the group. And then over time, that sexual freedom or whatever you want to call it became widespread throughout the whole cult. And like people that didn't want to participate in that were shamed or left the group or, were considered, weren't following God's law or weren't showing God's love. And then from there, over time, like it spread to adults and children having sexual contact with each other, which became encouraged by the cult leadership. And then it came out after that, the leader himself, he was like a pedophile and just a nasty person, That wasn't known at first, but then I'm assuming that had it been public knowledge at first, like there wouldn't have been too many people signing up to join, right? Or hopefully not anyways, But then by the time it came knowledge, like people were already so indoctrinated and stuff that for whatever reason, they thought that this was a good idea to be involved in this.
Yeah, I mean, oftentimes, it really does take like being so deep into the sort of system for you to not be able to see the other side of it, right? When you're really locked into the whole ideology of
Yeah,
it.
as in like an outsider's perspective, it seems just bizarre and unbelievable. But it's like the story of the boiling the frog. It's like a little bit at a
Yeah.
time, and then slowly, just your mind is so warped or brainwashed by these teachings that people just saw it as normal, and it was excused as like as long as it's done with love, then it's fine. Which obviously it wasn't. But yeah.
Yeah. And it's like, something like this that's so illogical doesn't even really need to be explained so much. Talk to me a little bit about like the critical thinking. Did anybody ever question it or ask why? Or why do we need to do this and why not this? Or
Yeah, it was strongly frowned on and like discouraged, and there'd be punishments for if you spoke your mind or you had any doubt. He'd be compared to like doubting Thomas, whatever, from the Bible, and that you were, weren't weren't trusting in God and stuff, so you were shamed. And like, I remember as a child, just having some simple questions. Like I was a real nerd. Like most of the time, all we had to read was cult publications and stuff. So we had a little more freedom in our home depending on where we were living and if we were on our own or with other cult families. So we had like encyclopedias and some outside magazines and stuff, which was very unusual in the cult. There's a lot of cult publications that were plagiarized. I remember one of them was the story of this World War I hero that was a hero of Moses David there, the cult leader. And then I remember just from reading up on it on my own that the numbers and the story didn't quite match up. And so when I brought that up, and they're like, oh, well, obviously the encyclopedia and the biography you're reading is wrong. And I'm like, oh, really? Oh, well, okay, if you say so. And then you get silence restriction or, and I was just really young at the time, but you'd have to be assigned a whole bunch of reading about the cult to get you back out of this wickedness or whatever,
so what about like if doomsday never came? I mean, I'm sure they'd set up a date. The apocalyptic day is arriving.
Yeah.
Everyone prepare. What would happen then?
Yeah, you'd think like, in their late 60s, you were nearly like 2 decades away from 86 or whatever, right? So you figured you had some time, whatever. And then when it came, I remember like, oh, well, they were a bit quiet on it for a bit. And then after they're like, it's actually come to pass, but it's behind the scenes. It's just not public. They were talking about when barcodes first came out, and that was like one of the marks of the beast or the end time. And it was like secret codes in there, or whatever. Yeah, and like the UN was like a big thing that was part of this one world government that was going to be satanically run, and that was the Antichrist, whatever was behind it. And then they try to figure out who it was, which one of these world leaders it was and stuff. And people continued to fall for it. And then later on, as it got into the 90s, it was more so like, oh, God changed his mind. He's delaying for a bit, It's like, oh, nothing's set in stone and all that. So people continue to follow blindly and send, tithes and send their family fortunes to the cult and whatnot. So it worked out well for the cult hierarchy anyways,
Yeah. You mentioned that they used to send their fortune over. So is that the main way that they were making money and surviving?
No, well, they had some businesses and stuff, these like radio stations, and their followers would go out and sell literature and beg for donations, or they also had sponsors that would help out, and people were well off. The cult would deliberately go out of their way to, get in good with, and then get them sending donations or donating use of properties or businesses or facilities, whatever. But generally, I think most of the cult income came from the cult members that would send like a tithe in every month, like the minimum 10 to 15% of their income, plus all these donations, and then they would sell video cassettes or cassette tapes or whatever else that would go to the cult, cover expenses and whatnot.
You talked about families were encouraged to have as many kids as possible so that you could increase the number of people. So you had 4 siblings?
Yeah, there was 5 with my parents' original marriage, and then both of them later on divorced and got remarried. And then, so there was like blended families. So there was like about 11 of us, like blended, right? Like step brothers and sisters and whatnot. For most of them, yeah, like it was, we moved around so much that, and then the cult also, they would try to break up family bonds and ties and mess with all that to keep people dependent on the cult and see that as their family, and like eliminate like family supports and whatnot. So there's like homes that would have been staffed mostly by younger women that would be like, their job would be just like childcare, be a bunch of children, like say several boys within a few years of each other in one room and some girls in the other room and stuff. And then we were taught that other cult children were our true brothers and sisters, and like the cult adults would have been our uncles and aunts, and we called the cult leader grandpa. The adults referred to him as dad or father or whatever. Yeah, it's still like, it's at least like most cults, if you look at them, they seem to have similar ways of operating to break down family ties and all that, and make you 100% dependent on the cult. So like if you were a cult member, you were like the enlightened ones, but anybody outside of the cult was like the, say, normal society, they referred to as the system, or and people that were in it were systemites, and these people were either dangerous to you, they're out to harm you, or they were just unenlightened and didn't know and ignorant. And so your duty was to either decide if they were referred to as sheep or goats. So like sheep were someone, like that were just ignorant or whatever, but unknowing and needed to be informed of the truth. Whereas the goats were the ones that you had to watch out for that would harm you. And then later on, like the police or the government agencies were considered wolves. So we were trained to be in fear of police or, say like a child welfare agency or anything like that, and lie to them. And for a while, like we were actually, my family and most of us, we went to school and stuff, but a lot of these cult people didn't go to school. They were homeschooled, and if they were homeschooled, that was like the education was lousy, other than basic. We were taught as a very young age to read and write and sing and whatnot. And, most of us could beg for donations in like 20 different languages or something, or sing some religious song like that, as far as like, other than calculating percentages for tithes or what you had to send back to the cult, was basic math skills weren't really considered important, or science or history, and then science was considered the work of the devil to deny God's creation because of the theory of evolution and all that. Is, like just bizarre.
Yeah. Well, of course, yeah, if they were to teach, scientific knowledge, or even just like processes, right? Ways of thinking as a scientist.
Or critical thinking or anything. Yeah. Anything. They don't want you doing too much, exercising your brain too much, because then you might start asking questions and, see that you're being sold a bill of goods. That's,
exactly.
Yeah.
So can you walk me through a typical day for you as a child in the cult?
It was like early morning, like reveille, and you'd get up and be woken up by some adult coming in there, somebody blowing a trumpet or a horn or shouting reveille or ringing a bell or something. And then you'd wake up, and then you would get up and brush your teeth and clean your room. And then you'd have devotions, which they call, reading some of the Bible maybe, and then but mostly cult publications or literature. And then you'd have breakfast, and then everybody had their chores. Like the kids were expected to, clean the tables and clear them, and then wash dishes, sweep floors, whatever. And then there'd be, the older children were expected to take care of the younger children, like change diapers, supervise them, get them, spend time reading cult publications with them. And then your whole life was revolved around the cult. And the cult, like if you lived in a co-op home, they call it, which was like multiple cult families living together, then, you'd go in, your whole life was devoted to that cult and that, taking care of the home. And then after school hours, they'd take the kids and send them out with donation cans and passing out literature or or the adults would be playing the guitar and the kids would be singing, like busking for donations or whatever. Like it was all there to raise money. And then the cult homes or cult families would keep a percentage of what they took in. The rest would be sent to the cult for administration or whatever, The cult, like they were raking in millions of dollars and not declaring it or anything like that. And then meanwhile, the average cult member lived in poverty, but it was encouraged, like you were getting too comfortable, then you were in danger of turning into a systemite or losing your devotion to the cult or whatever. So you wanted to be like, the 12 apostles or something, and, not get too comfortable anywhere, and, not have too many personal belongings or anything.
So is that why they would move you all around a lot? You mentioned that you'd been to many different countries.
Yeah. Part of it, I think, was at certain times there was investigations, which they called persecution of the cult. Like in Germany in the 70s, late 70s, my parents were out there. And then my mom came back like just before I was born to Canada because she didn't want me to be born here. And then we went back. And then at the time there was some investigation going on there. So we left there, and then their cult was in Israel, I guess, and they were thrown out of there. So then that's when the cult took a very anti-Semitic turn at that point. And there was all the letters from the leader there ranting about, the goddamn Jews and whatnot, and how God was going to destroy them. It's just, very bizarre,
Can you tell me a little bit about flirty fishing? And was that something that was close to you? Anyone you know?
Most adult females, like it happened all over, I guess, but I believe it was probably most prominent in like second or third world countries as a form of fundraising. I know in the Philippines and places like that, the cult had really infiltrated government and military. And then I believe that the cult was thinking that they would be able to form their own state or something, like have an uprising. And then the cult leader thought that he would be calling the shots from behind the scenes. But it was mainly a fundraising tool, or to, I guess, gain influence. Adult women would be sent out to, go and meet men. They were targeted ones that were successful or prominent, or that them being favorable to the cult would have a benefit to the cult itself. The women were seen as they were doing their part. It was God's will, and that they were showing God's love to these men, and then in return, any financial benefit came out with God's blessing,
And if any of them resulted in children?
Yeah, there was a lot of that. There was a lot of, say, like white couples with like brown children or something, or like they're different colored. So they were, that began to become a bit of a problem. So then they were called Jesus babies, and then it was explained as this child was adopted, or they used to say to like make up on these babies when you're going for like your visa or passport photos and stuff, so that if you got two blonde-haired, blue-eyed parents, and then there's a brown-skinned and brown-eyed baby, it might be a little difficult to explain. So, but there was a lot of that, and that was encouraged. Like I know, like I still have contact with some people I knew from the cult when I was younger, right? That are still friends. I think they're all obviously out of it, but some of them they were the odd one out in their family. They don't share the same father as the rest of their brothers and sisters or whatever,
You mentioned as well earlier that some of the adults were asked or forced or made to share partners and sleep with each other. I think this is called sharing schedules. Was this something that was a regular thing that was happening on a weekly basis? What is a sharing schedule?
Yeah, I guess like some places had that. I think there was a lot of times too, it might have just been a free for all. Like, hey, if somebody had their eye on someone else's wife or husband, whatever, vice versa, they were like, hey, you want to spend some time together? And then if the spouse took objection to that, then, they were considered out of God's will and not following the law of love or whatever. So there would be repercussions for that. So.
Was the same thing reversed as well? So if a woman were to approach a man asking for it, would it be the same way?
Yeah, I believe so, but I'm assuming it was probably more one-sided for the men looking for more sexual partners than the woman, but I could be wrong on that, you know.
Yeah. The cult is also sort of known for its abuse towards younger children. So is there an age over here that this was kind of mostly happening to? I remember reading somewhere that it was, they would consider a minor once they turn 12. They're considered to be an adult and treated the
Yeah,
same way.
well, 12 was like sort of a junior adult. I guess when they had their R&R, whatever they call it, the revolution in the 70s, and they purged a lot of the cult leadership that was personally enriching themselves. Then that's when they announced all kinds of like changes, and it went really bizarre. Adults would go and have sexual contact with children, but it was fine as long as it was done in the spirit of love or whatever, apparently, you know, according to them. Like there was the story of Davidito. It came out like Moses David, the cult leader, his wife Maria got impregnated by some Spanish waiter or something, and so they raised the son as the prototype, like the ideal cult child, you know, and like his upbringing was supposed to be what the other adults and parents in the cult would strive for to achieve, you know. So basically documented all of his discipline and upbringing, and like, and also like his sexual abuse and stuff, like what they did to him. And that was considered, you know, the ideal way to raise your child.
So they documented this and they wrote them in their scriptures in their books and actually distributed it for everyone to learn from.
Right. Like within all the cult members to learn from, right? Like it wasn't shared with the general public or anything. Like it was kept secret. Like if you were new to the cult, you wouldn't have been shown some of these things until, you know, you had gone through all the stages and you were like a full-fledged member. And once they were considered you to be completely on board and brainwashed or whatever in the 90s and 80s. And now the cult denies the existence of these books and that was ever part of their teachings or anything. But, you know, there is proof out there. Like I saw the books myself, you know, and they still, most of them were destroyed, but there's still a couple complete cult library collections at a couple universities have them and stuff. And also some former members have held on to them.
So if an adult decided they did not want to participate in any kind of sexual activity with minors, or same for the children said, no, I don't want this. You said that there was kind of punishments. What were the punishments?
Well, for the, like say for a young girl, whatever, like that didn't want to have sexual contact with a adult male, you know, it would be guilt, being forced to read cult publications about the law of love or about how they were being selfish or were out of God's spirit or unloving and pressured on that. And then, you know, if that wasn't enough to change their minds, then, you know, there could be beatings or confined to your room or silence restrictions or denied meals and stuff, like fasting until you decide that you're going to go along with the program.
Did you ever experience any of punishment?
The boys mostly just had to deal with physical abuse and I guess mental, yelling and beatings and stuff. Corporal punishment was encouraged, but it was like being beaten with straps or paddles or metal coat hangers and stuff. Like it was like the more the abuse handed out was considered like better for your upbringing and stuff, and encouraged by the cult leader, you know, like it was spare the rod and spoil the child type thing, you know. So the children were taught to accept it and that it was being done out of love and for their own good. Otherwise they were going to lose their place in the kingdom of heaven, or, you know, in danger of becoming systemites or something like that, you know. So
can you tell me about one specific memory of yours while being in it? Something that really stood out to you?
oh, there was so many. It was like every day was like I don't remember ever being super convinced of the truth behind this cult. Like I'm sure I was when I was really young, but as soon as I was able to start thinking on my own, I questioned everything, you know, and had doubts. And so I was constantly getting in trouble for voicing them. I was a voice of dissension or giving voice to the devil's doubts and stuff. So, you'd be dealt with harshly and face some sort of penalty for that, or just even asking a question about anything, like if it was seen as if you were doubting the cult leader, that he was divinely inspired or whatever. I remember it's believed that the cult leader suffered from untreated syphilis, which would make sense because over the years you could see him getting more and more deranged and like outlandish and stuff. So like I remember when he claimed that he had all these spiritual advisors or guides that were coming to him in his dreams, or he was hearing voices that was divinely inspired. Some of his spirit guides, one of them was the Pied Piper, like the children's tale, like, yeah, and then the other one was Don Quixote, like that, the Man of La Mancha, like by Miguel Cervantes there. So I'm like, well, these are fictional characters. Like, I was like, so how could you have somebody that doesn't exist giving you advice, and they're like, oh, well, that didn't go over very well with the adults in the cult at all, like, how dare you question and blah, blah, blah. Who do you think you are? And whatnot.
I know when we spoke last time, you told me a little bit about the retraining camps. What were those?
Well, I was fortunate enough at the time, the one that I was supposed to have gone to when I was 10, like usually was 12 and up, but they'd make exceptions like 10 or 11 also. And so the one I was supposed to go to would have been in Mexico. And my mother's husband, like my stepfather at the time, he was extremely abusive. And like by the time I was 10, I was already like, I had enough and I was standing up to him, and like openly defiant to him. And then I was also like big for my age. And so he was like a little guy. So, he wasn't able to push me around as much as he wanted to. So he was trying hard to get me sent to Mexico there. And I was accepted. So when I was 10, I was supposed to go. And then for whatever reason, I guess I just was fortunate. And my mom didn't send me, which was very unusual because it was like the highest honor to go to these things, right? And they'd rent some compound, or like could have been like a former, like, say, Boy Scout camp or, or school or something. And then they'd just fill it with like bunk beds or cots, whatever, and the kids would sleep there. And then under complete control of the adults that were like the ideal cult members, like totally, completely brainwashed and willing to do whatever they were told to by the cult. But I do know personally people that went through there, and like it was terrible. Like they were physical, mental, sexual abuse. Any questions, you were put on sound restriction, locked in rooms for like days at a time, denied food and water. If you didn't go along with the program, you'd be considered to be demon possessed or whatever, and they'd be like held down and beaten, trying to, to have the devil beaten out of you, or like weird forms like exorcisms, whatever. Like there was a lot of young people that grew up in there that lost their lives to like drugs or suicide, like in the following years, and it's still ongoing. It's tragic how many lives, both adult and child, were lost and ruined due to this cult.
Did you ever sort of look back and maybe blame your parents for the formative years of your life?
Well, it wasn't ideal, and I'm not super close with my parents to this day. It's like I was fortunate enough that my mom finally had enough and left when I was about 14 or 15 years old. But by that point, he's already, there's a lot of damage had already been done. I'm a parent myself now, and it's like, no one in their right mind would ever want to bring up a family or a child like this, and I'm like super protective of my children, and like, we're obviously way more focused on financial security and, whatnot than, let's just go, bomb around the world and see what happens, and like, what's the worst that could happen, like, I don't get it, I don't see how you'd think your parental instinct would be more ingrained in you than the cult, teachings, whatever. But I guess by this point, everybody was so brainwashed and whatnot that they were basically just, robots and did whatever the cult told them,
Yeah, it's almost like in their head, they are doing the best they can by protecting you and by bringing you closer to, enlightenment and the righteous path.
Well, that's exactly it. Like it was, you were the the cult, according to them, like we were the only enlightened ones and we were doing God's will. And so the people that weren't members, like the systemites, whatever, they were wrong. But like if you turned your back on the cult beliefs, you were like shunned and you were considered like an apostate, like you were an infidel, you were the worst of the worst, because you were shown like God's divine will or light or whatever, and you turned your back on it, that you were excommunicated, and like no one in the cult would have had anything to do with you. Like that would have been your whole family, like everyone you would have known your whole life would have been in that. And then you were going to hell, like you were, chose to do the work of Satan or something instead of God,
Are any of your siblings or stepbrothers or sisters or friends still in the cult?
The last I'd heard a couple of years ago, like after the death of David Berg, whatever, his wife took over and then she got remarried. And then they weren't really able to sustain the same amount of like, religious fervor, whatever that David Berg had inspired, So it's sort of the numbers were declining and money wasn't coming in as much. And so like I think basically now they just have like an online presence. It's like there's not really much new material from them coming out, but they're still collecting tithes and stuff. But none of my brothers or sisters or anything, as far as I know, still has anything to do with it really,
What is your view on religion now? Are you a believer?
No, unless it's, some really weird religion or something. Like, I respect people's right to believe, or, everybody has their own reasons, whatever. But I have no time for like, evangelical, or extremist, any extreme, like I stay away from, I don't raise my kids religious at all, but if they were to bring it up that they wanted to go to Sunday school or go with their friends, I wouldn't stop them, but I don't encourage anything with them, which now and then sometimes like maybe it feels like there's something missing, because like religion was just ingrained in us from just beaten into us from such a young age, and it's like, if you're not religious, whatever, then you're wasting your life and stuff. But I'm fine with, our lifestyle and the way we live, it's, if they want to get into it, they can, but I'm not going to encourage anything one way or another,
You got out when you were fairly young. So I think, what was it like readjusting back into society? What were the things that you had to relearn and unlearn coming back into the normal world?
Well, it was a definite adjustment, but due to the fact that I had gone to public school or private schools when I was younger, I had some experience already with like the system, whatever you want to call it. So it wasn't as big a shock as what some people went through. But it, like when I was, say, like in grade school and I was going through there and just fitting in was like, because we were taught that these kids were expected to either go and like preach to them, at recess or something, which obviously is going to make you a bit of a weird kid, or like, we got picked on a lot. And then we lived like fairly well off, at least by cult standards, when my parents were together. And then my mom remarried, and her second husband, who was, as far as the cult went, he was a very decent person. And so we weren't poor by any stretch of the imagination until my mom got married for the third time. And married a complete like loser, no prospects, no job, nothing, and so then that was a shock to the system, like, going and having clothes out of donation bins or thrift stores and things like that. And then wearing them at school and getting picked on because of that, and whatnot. And then we also wouldn't have known anything about like just like what every other kid known. Like we weren't allowed to watch like most shows or cartoons or listen to like secular music like the radio or MTV or anything like that. That was all kept from us. Like that was all the system music and shows were evil and was going to corrupt your mind. So like I remember like we'd sneak and watch like Transformers or or G.I. Joe or something, and if we got caught, we knew we were going to get a beating for that. But it was still worth the risk, when we were like 5-6 years old. But then after like as a teenager when we left, it was by the last couple of years in our cult existence, like we didn't have much contact with a lot of the cult like we had before. Like the city we were living in, most of the members there had left and gone to other places. So we were kind of on our own. So it wasn't as big a shock as like some people like that. We, at least we had like some education and some exposure to normal society and whatnot. Whereas like some of my friends and stuff have told me about, like, say they're living in Asia and then they decide to leave the cult and somehow make an emergency call to their grandparents or something for a flight to the United States or Canada from Asia or something, and go there and then land there and be like complete like aliens in a strange world, not knowing anything about any current events or trivia or science or anything, just left on their own to figure out life for themselves. Like, those are the ones that I feel for. It seems like among former members, I'm a member of a few groups where I keep in touch with ex-members, sort of divided up into like first generation, like FGAs would be the adults that joined of their own free will. And then we would have been the SGAs, like second generation adults that were born into it. It seems like among the SGAs, like the second generation adults that grew up and then left the cult, it's the female members, the women that left, and they're the ones that seem to be really stepped up and are speaking out against the abuses that happen in the cult and raising awareness, but are also helping with counseling, or like a few of them have gone on to get like their degree in like psychology or whatever, and offering counseling to like former members and just doing the help. That is nice to see,
Even in terms of with the indoctrination, I mean, there must have been a lot of like teachings on intimacy and sex and how to please another person, and, the concept of consent. Again, this doesn't only apply to women, it also applied to males. So what was then your view on intimacy and all of that coming out of it? Relationships, how did you have relationships and trust in partners?
Coming out of it, and it was like, I think probably from the time I was 6 or 5, 6, 7, somewhere around that, I had already in my mind decided that it wasn't for me, so then you have this feeling of guilt. You're going against what you're brought up. I guess there's something wrong with me for not believing all this stuff. Then I just knew it wasn't for me. So I didn't buy too much into that. So it's just like when we were teenagers and stuff and had our first girlfriends and stuff, it was just whatever, normal. We didn't know what we were doing, going through I guess early on, like there was a highly sexual environment, and like all the adult publications and stuff, and which the children were shown too, was like, sexual drawings. And like, I guess as the cult went on, like the leader there just showed his true colors more and more, and like he was obsessed with sex, I guess, or something. Like everything somehow had a sexual component to it or something, I guess, I don't know, maybe we just tuned it out or something. Like we just, like my brothers and I were looking at it and we were just sort of like mocking it, it was like a kind of a joke to us. But I'm sure like other kids saw it differently, or took it seriously. But for us, it was just whatever, like I guess maybe we'd seen so much of it that it wasn't even shocking or interesting to us anymore,
Yeah, it's difficult. Were you ever encouraged to seek therapy after it?
No, I probably should have, but I didn't. Like, I guess I was used to doing so much, like, we're told to like examine our minds and our thoughts and look through it, and like self-examination or whatever. So I guess maybe that's sort of what I did to myself after, and just work things out on my own, like as a young man, like out of the cult and stuff, like I had some anger issues and rage, and I used to like to get in trouble, like fighting all the time and stuff and whatnot. But, eventually as time goes on and you see that it's not getting you anywhere in life and it's costing you money and it's getting in the way of you making money, that, start to realize that, maybe you got to change what path you're on, I used to work for a child welfare agency with abused children, like when I was in my 20s and early 30s. I understood like how, abuse like is cycles, and it's, could be multi-generations doing it and stuff. But for me, I also had a problem justifying that, because I just looked back on my own childhood, and I remember thinking like, when I was getting like severely beaten as like a young kid and stuff, I was like, what kind of adult would want to do this to a child, like, and like, what would they gain from this? And then I was like I thought I was never going to have children of my own, but I also remember saying like, I will never do this to anyone else, like just knowing how much it affected me and how much I didn't enjoy it, like, so I was like, allow myself to subject someone else to that. That was one thing, working with abused children and then having to meet with their parents and stuff. And I found it hard to be civil to them, I guess. And they go, well, the parents were victims of abuse themselves. Like, well, at some point there's personal responsibility and whatnot, like you can only use that excuse so far in life, I suppose. Yeah.
Yeah, there's only so much compassion that we can extend and just sort of like sit there and look and, feel bad or empathetic that, at the end of the day, yes.
Yeah, like if you're harming an innocent child or whatever, it's like, I don't know, I'm not going to give you too much sympathy. Like, maybe I'm a little more cold than a lot of people. Like, I don't feel sorry for a whole lot of people, and like we did so much giving and charity work and whatnot as when we were kids. So, like I'm not out there like volunteering to knit gloves for the homeless or anything like that. Like it's just like, that's not really my problem, is how I see it. So maybe it's made me a little cold and whatnot, but that's just the way it is,
I mean, regardless, I feel like it's pretty amazing that you have been able to reconcile with all of this kind of on your own, like do the processing on your own, spend the time with yourself, do the self-care, the self, love.
Yeah, well, if I hadn't, like, who knows what, God forbid, I might have ended up like some monster myself or something, or, abusive or whatnot, so it was that, or, he had to do something. Otherwise, the odds are I would have gone down a real dark path or something, so it wasn't something that I wanted to get into,
Just to wrap up this interview, just one last question. So what kind of piece of advice, given everything that you've experienced in your life, would you give to our listeners today?
I would say if you're online and you see something from TFI, like the Family International or anything like that, like don't order any of their books or videos or publications, and like don't support them. Like they've managed to fly under the radar, and like a simple web search would turn up the history. But like I know that there was like school boards or districts, whatever, that were buying materials from them, not knowing that they were directly supporting an abusive cult and whatnot. So I'd say that's one thing. And also, I would recommend not joining a cult if you have a choice in it.
Any like telltale signs that a person can look out for?
From what I've seen after, it seems like most cults, they seem to have a lot of characteristics in common. Early on, like the love bombing, they make you feel, oh, we love you, come with us, we're all like a family here. And they just go after like, someone that's not happy in their current situation, whatever. And then then the control sets in, right? Like cutting off contact from your real family or your friends or society, whatever, and those are usually telltale, and then it becomes abusive. And then also it seems like the ones that are led by men, for some reason, all of them seem to get this divine inspiration from God, that God wants them to start taking on multiple wives and have sex with all the female members or something, It seems to be another common characteristic with them, So if you're seeing those things, then you're probably in a cult, or, should probably try to get out.
Yeah, thank you so much for your time today, and for that insight. I think that it's something that's not really talked about very much in some cultures, in some countries. So it's really insightful, and I do believe our listeners will take away a lot from this.
Yeah, and I'd say if you know somebody that's you think may be involved in some weird group or a cult, like take the time and reach out to them and try to let them know that they're loved or thought of, and don't let them get completely brainwashed until they're no longer part of your life.
Thank you once again. Thank you so much for your time tonight.
Yeah, no problem. It was great talking to you. You have a good day.
If you enjoyed the episode and would like to help support the show, please follow and subscribe. You can rate and review your feedback on any of our platforms listed in the description. I'd like to recognize our guests who are vulnerable and open to share their life experiences with us. Thank you for showing us we're human. Also, a thank you to our team who worked so hard behind the scenes to make it happen.
Joe Mills,
Chris Trzynski,
Stefan Menzel.
The show would be nothing without you. I'm Jenica, host and writer of the show, and you're listening to Multispective.